Walt Finch saw the girl before anyone else did. He was sitting on this bank of Redemption Creek, 6 miles upstream from the town that bore its name, a fishing line slack in the water, and a pocket knife turning slow circles through a block of cottonwood. 71 years old, hands still steady, eyes still sharp, the pale blue-gray of winter sky, the kind of eyes that had watched so many seasons turn that nothing surprised them anymore. Or so he believed. It was late June. The Kansas prairie lay golden and shimmering under a sun that seemed closer than it had any right to be, pressing down on the flatland with a heat that turned the air into something you could see, a liquid trembling above the dirt road that ran from the east and disappeared into the west like a sentence that never found its period. Walt had been fishing this stretch of Redemption Creek since before the war, the second one, and he knew every rock and riffle and deep green pool where the catfish gathered in the shade. He came here not for the fish, but for the quiet, which was a different thing from silence. Silence was the absence of sound. Quiet was the presence of peace. Walt had been chasing quiet for 23 years, ever since Helen died, and he found it most reliably on this particular bend of the creek, under this particular cottonwood tree, with the water talking to itself in a language that asked nothing of him. The girl appeared on the dirt road leading into town, a small figure moving against the gold shimmer of the afternoon heat. She walked the way wounded animals walk when they have been driven from the pack. Not panicked, not lost, just moving forward because standing still meant dying. Each step was deliberate, and even as if she had already decided something final and the walking was merely the consequence. Walt set down his knife. He watched her pass through town without stopping, watched the faces appear behind windows and vanish again, watched the quick, cold glances that assessed and dismissed her before she had taken a dozen steps down Main Street. He knew Redemption Creek. He knew what it did to strangers, especially strangers who carried nothing worth trading. She was young, 18, maybe 19, thin in a way that could have been natural build or could have been hunger. Brown hair pulled back loose from a face that was all angles and determination. She carried a leather satchel over one shoulder, a man's bag, old and cracked, and she held the strap with both hands, as if it contained something more valuable than its worn exteriors suggested. Her clothes were dusty, her boots scuffed, and everything about her said she had been walking for days. But it was not her appearance that held Walt's attention. It was the way she moved through the hostility of those watching eyes, without flinching, without hurrying, without acknowledging their existence. She walked through judgment the way water walks through rock, by not fighting it, by simply continuing. The girl walked past the last building on Main Street and turned up the hill, toward the silo. Walt leaned forward on the creek bank. He watched her stand at the base of that rusted metal tower, place one hand flat against the curved wall, and hold it there for a long time. Her palm pressed against the steel as if she were taking the pulse of something living, like she was listening to a frequency inside the metal that only she could hear. Her body was very still. The prairie wind moved her hair, but nothing else. Then she walked through the open doorway and disappeared into the dark interior. Walt picked up his knife and then put it down again. He looked at the cottonwood block he had been carving, which was becoming nothing in particular, which was always what his carvings became. He looked up at the silo on the hill, rust red against the pale sky, that ruined monument, to the day the railroad changed its mind about Redemption Creek. He said to the river, or to himself, or to no one at all. He picked up the knife and went back to carving. But his eyes kept returning to the hill, and the carving never did become anything. To understand the girl, you must first understand the man who made her, and I do not mean her father. Samuel Reed was born in 1898 on Kansas dirt not so different from the dirt beneath Walt Finch's boots. He grew up on a wheat farm, the youngest of four brothers, the one who was always looking at things too closely, turning rocks over, studying the way rainwater carved channels in the yard, after storms, pressing his palm against the walls of the barn and asking his father why the corners cracked every winter while the round water tank never did. His father told him to stop asking foolish questions and go feed the chickens. At 19 in 1917, Samuel enlisted when America entered the Great War and shipped out to France. He fought on the Western Front. He lived in trenches. He lived in the earth itself month after month, underground in a maze of narrow passages and reinforced chambers carved into the soil of northern France, while the world above him was systematically destroyed by artillery fire. In those trenches, surrounded by mud and terror and the smell of things a young man from Kansas should never have had to smell, Samuel Reed learned the most important lesson of his life. It was not a lesson about war. It was a lesson about walls. When the shells fell, and they fell constantly, a rain of high explosive that turned the air into shrapnel and the ground into fountains of dirt and stone, the structures above ground failed. The wooden bunkers splintered. The concrete pillboxes cracked along their corners and collapsed inward. Every right angle was a stress point. Every flat wall was a target that caught the full force of the blast wave and transferred it inward to the men inside, who died not from the explosion itself, but from the geometry of their shelter. But the trenches held. The earthen walls, hand-packed, curved where they needed to curve at the junctions and corners, absorbed the shock waves instead of transmitting them. The dirt did not crack because dirt does not have joints. It does not have corners. It is continuous plastic yielding. When a shock wave hit an earthen wall, the wall flexed and absorbed and dissipated the energy through its mass. The dirt did not break. The dirt only bent. Samuel came home in 1919 carrying two things, nightmares that would follow him for the rest of his life, and a leather notebook full of sketches of earthen walls and underground shelters. The notebook was the beginning of everything. After the war, while other veterans were trying to forget what they had seen, Samuel went looking for more knowledge about the material that had saved his life. He wandered the American Southwest through New Mexico and Arizona, sleeping under his truck and eating canned beans until he found the Pueblo villages. Adobe structures built from clay and straw, dried in the sun, standing for hundreds of years in a landscape that should have destroyed them. Walls 2 feet thick that kept the interior cool when the desert temperature reached 115 degrees and warm when it dropped below zero at night. He sat with the Pueblo builders for weeks. He did not pretend to be an expert. He sat and watched and asked questions in the humble, tentative way of a man who knows he is in the presence of knowledge far older than his own. They showed him how to select clay, how to test it for the right mineral content, how to mix it with straw in proportions that created a material stronger than the sum of its parts. They showed him how curved walls distribute force evenly, how thick earthen walls store heat during the day and release it at night, how a round structure presents no flat surface for wind to push against. Samuel combined what the trenches taught him with what the Pueblo people shared, and over the next 20 years, he developed his own method of construction. Roundhouses, thick earthen walls made from cob, a mixture of clay, straw, and water packed by hand. Central stone hearths with chimney flues that ran through the walls before venting, heating the entire structure from within. He designed these homes for poor rural communities across the Midwest, communities that could not afford lumber and nails and the services of a licensed contractor. His homes cost almost nothing to build. They lasted for decades. They were cool in summer and warm in winter, and they stood up to winds that flattened conventional wooden structures. And for this, the world destroyed him. In the America of the 1920s and 1930s, the lumber and concrete industries were booming. A man promoting mud houses was not a visionary. He was a commercial threat. A local contractor named Horace Blunt, who had political connections in Topeka, launched a campaign to discredit Samuel. Newspaper articles appeared calling him the cave architect, the shell-shocked mud builder, the crazy veteran who wants America to live like savages. His professional license was revoked, and after a lawsuit funded by Blunt that Samuel could not afford to fight, the judge who played poker with Blunt on Thursdays ruled that Samuel's methods were primitive, unsafe, and contrary to accepted engineering standards. Samuel retreated to his farm outside Carver, Kansas. He became a recluse. He continued building and experimenting on his own land, but the world had declared its verdict. He was the crazy old man on the hill. The community that had once tolerated his eccentricity now used him as a cautionary tale. That is what happens when you think you know better than everyone else. His son Frank grew up marinated in that humiliation. Children at school called Frank the mud boy. Teachers gave him looks of pity that were worse than cruelty, because pity assumes permanent damage. Frank swore on every god he could name that when he grew up, he would be the most normal, most conventional, most perfectly ordinary man in the county, and he kept that promise with the fervor of a convert. He married a quiet woman named Mary, built a white wooden farmhouse with right angles and straight lines and not one curve anywhere, planted wheat, went to church, buried everything his father represented under layers of conformity so thick that he almost forgot what lay beneath. Almost, but not entirely, Because the thing about burying something alive is that you can always hear it breathing if the house gets quiet enough. Samuel died in 1956 at 58 years old in his round earthen workshop, surrounded by his notebooks and his drawings and the smell of clay. His granddaughter Callie was 12. She was the only one who cried at the funeral because she was the only one who had spent afternoons on his knee learning the secrets he had carried home from the trenches in the desert. She was the only one who had his eyes. Pale gray, clear as creek water, the eyes of someone who looks at the world and sees not what is there but what could be. Frank saw those eyes every day, and every day they reminded him of the father who had made him a joke. When Callie started shaping clay in the garden, building small round structures with her bare hands, Frank felt the old dread rising in his chest like floodwater. History was repeating. His daughter was becoming his father, and he could not bear it. The night it ended was a Tuesday in June, the summer Callie turned 18. She had been building in secret for weeks a model house in the far corner of the garden behind the cornrows where Frank rarely went. It was small, no taller than her knee, but it was perfect. A miniature round house with smooth curved walls, a tiny arched doorway, and a window facing east to catch the morning light. She had used creek clay and dry grass and water mixed by hand, shaped by hand, dried in the sun. 3 weeks of careful, patient work. The proportions were based on drawings she remembered from her grandfather's workshop, remembered with the imperfect accuracy of a child's memory, but captured with the intuition of inherited understanding. Frank found it on a Tuesday afternoon while chasing a stray chicken behind the corn. He stood over it for a long time, his face going through a sequence of expressions that ended at a place beyond anger, a place that was cold and final. He crushed it under his boot, slowly, deliberately, grinding the clay and straw back into the dirt it had come from. Callie heard the sound from inside the house. She knew that sound. She had heard it in her nightmares, the sound of something beautiful being returned to nothing. She ran to the garden and stood behind her father and saw the ruin at his feet. The sky was doing something dramatic with the sunset reds and golds and a strip of violent purple along the western horizon, but neither of them noticed. They were standing at the end of something that had been fraying for years, and both of them knew it. Frank did not shout. That was the terrifying part. His voice was low, controlled, the voice of a man who had held his anger so long. It was no longer hot but cold, the temperature of something that has died. I told you, how many times? Callie opened her mouth, and Frank raised one hand, not in threat, but in warning, the way you raise a hand to stop traffic. I told you how many times. Slower. Each word a separate stone dropped into still water. None of this. In my house. Callie looked at the broken clay at her father's feet. 3 weeks. Creek clay carried in her cupped hands. Prairie grass cut with a kitchen knife. Every curve smoothed with her fingers until it was seamless. Gone. Grandpa Samuel was not crazy, Dad. Her voice was steady, but trembled at the end. The tremble of someone who knows they are touching a wound the other person has spent a lifetime keeping covered. Frank stepped back, not from fear. The words hit him the way a doctor's words hit you when they say the name of something you have been pretending you do not have. His face changed. The cold anger drained away, and what replaced it was worse, exhaustion, the kind that lives in the marrow. Your grandfather, he said, and his voice was different now, raw, stripped of performance, almost quiet. Your grandfather lived in a mud house. He let this family become a joke. Your grandmother died of pneumonia in that mud house because he was too proud and too stubborn to install a proper furnace. My mother, dead at 51, in a house made of dirt. He paused. The crickets were starting up in the grass. The sunset was fading from red to a deep, bruised blue. He was a stubborn, selfish old man, and you... Frank pointed at Callie. His hand was shaking and he could not stop it. You are so much like him that I look at you and I want to... He did not finish. His jaw clamped shut. The unfinished sentence hung in the air between them, more frightening than any completed thought could have been. Get out of my house tomorrow morning before sunrise. He turned. The screen door slammed. His footsteps crossed the kitchen floor. Heavy, uneven, the walk of a man who has just cut off his own hand and is not yet sure he has done it. The truth that Frank could not see, because pain does not allow precision, was more complicated than he knew. Samuel's wife had died of pneumonia during a harsh winter, yes, but she had refused to go to the hospital because she was as stubborn as her husband, and the real cause of her death was a constellation of poverty, pride, and a rural medical system that barely existed. It was not the walls. It was never the walls. But Frank needed someone to blame, and the walls were the most visible symbol of everything his father had chosen over normalcy, over safety, over the kind of life that does not make your son a target. Frank was not a monster. He was a man who had been wounded by his father's choices, not because his father was wrong, but because his father was right in a way the world punished, and Frank was the one who caught the punishment. His fear for Callie was real. He looked at his daughter and saw the same trajectory that had destroyed his childhood: the stubbornness, the clay, the round shapes, the gray eyes lit with a fire that the world would try to extinguish. He wanted to save her from it, but fear wrapped in anger does not know how to save. It only knows how to push away. That night, the house was dark and silent. Frank had locked his bedroom door. Callie heard him moving on the other side, the creak of bed springs, the sound of a glass being set down, the thick stillness of a man sitting alone with what he had done. Callie sat on her bed and packed everything she owned into a leather satchel that had belonged to her grandfather. The leather was cracked, the strap fraying at the buckle, but it smelled like earth and pipe tobacco and the faint sweetness of dried straw, and holding it was the closest she could get to holding Samuel's hand. The door opened softly. Mary Reed stepped in. Callie's mother was 43, but the years had not been gentle. She was thin in a way that had nothing to do with choice and everything to do with a body that had been slowly surrendering for a long time. Her brown hair had gone gray early at the temples, and her eyes, dark and deep, carried the particular sadness of a woman who had made a wrong turn years ago and had walked the wrong road ever since without complaint, because complaining would have required admitting the turn was wrong, and that admission would have collapsed the only structure she had left. Mary did not speak much. She had learned early in her marriage that Frank's voice filled the house the way water fills a jar, completely leaving no room for anything else. She had adapted by becoming small, by becoming quiet, by folding herself into corners and margins and the spaces between Frank's certainties. It was not a good life, but it was a recognizable one, and sometimes that is enough for people who are afraid. She sat on the bed beside Callie. She pressed a cloth pouch into her daughter's hand. Inside every dollar she had managed to save over years of small economies, coins and crumpled bills, maybe $40 total. A fortune of self-denial. Then Mary put her arms around her daughter and held her. Her body was so light against Callie's that it felt like being held by a memory rather than a person. Callie could feel her mother's ribs through the cotton nightgown, could feel the trembling that Mary could not control, and it frightened her more than Frank's anger, because anger is at least a sign of life, and what she felt in her mother's body was something closer to departure. Mary whispered into Callie's hair, "Go west. There is a town called Redemption Creek." Callie pulled back. "How do you—" But Mary was already standing. At the bedroom door, she paused with her back to Callie and said in a voice so quiet it existed at the very edge of sound, "Your grandfather would be proud." Then she was gone. Soft footsteps on old wood growing fainter, disappearing into the silence of a house that had never been good at holding the things that mattered. What Callie did not know, what she would not discover for weeks, was what happened next. After Callie fell into a restless sleep, her last sleep in this house, her last sleep as someone's daughter, Mary came back. She moved through the dark bedroom with the practiced silence of a woman who had spent 20 years not making noise. She opened the small drawer of her writing desk, the one piece of furniture in the house that belonged to her alone that Frank never opened because he had no interest in whatever a quiet woman might keep in a small drawer. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a leather notebook, brown cover soft with age, faded handwriting on the front, S. Reed Field Notes. Mary had kept Samuel's notebook for 20 years. Since the day of his funeral, when she had taken it from his workshop while Frank was accepting condolences he did not want from people he did not like. She had hidden it the way she hid every important truth in her life, behind silence, inside a drawer no one else opened, protected by the simple camouflage of being invisible. She unzipped the inner lining of Callie's satchel and slid the notebook inside, pressing it flat against the leather bottom where it would not be felt unless someone was specifically searching. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, because this was the most consequential thing Mary Reed had ever done, and she was doing it in darkness, in secret, unwitnessed, which was exactly how every important thing in her life had happened. On the first page of the notebook, beneath Samuel's handwriting, Mary had added a line in blue ink. 7 words for my daughter, build what he dreamed. She stood over Callie's sleeping form for a long time. She memorized the shape of her daughter's face, the set of the jaw, the faint clay residue under the fingernails that no amount of scrubbing ever completely removed. Then she left the room and did not come back. Before dawn, Callie was gone. She paused at the end of the dirt drive and looked back at the house once. It stood against the pre-dawn sky exactly as it had always stood, white and square and rigid, a box designed to keep everything inside arranged in proper order. She wanted to remember its shape. She wanted to remember what she was leaving. Not because she would miss it, but because she needed to know what not to build. She turned her back on it and walked west. Upstairs behind the second-floor window, Frank Reed watched his daughter walk away. He did not open the door, did not call her name, but he stood there long after she vanished down the road, long after the dust settled, long after the wheat field had absorbed her into its golden anonymity. Then Frank sat down on the floor with his back against the wall and held his head in both hands. Men like Frank do not cry. They have trained that capacity out of themselves the way they train dogs not to beg at the table through repetition and punishment and the slow, steady replacement of feeling with function. But his body shook. Something inside his chest was trying to get out, and he would not let it. And the struggle between the two produced a tremor that started in his hands and spread through his whole frame until he was vibrating like a wire stretched too tight. On a shelf in the corner of his bedroom, face down where it had been for years, a small black and white photograph. Samuel Reed as a young man, 1917, in his Army uniform, smiling at the camera with the open, trusting smile of someone who had not yet learned what the world does to people who build differently. Frank had turned the photograph over years ago, but he had never thrown it away. That tells you everything about Frank Reed. 3 days of walking and hitching rides brought Callie to the edge of Redemption Creek on a Friday afternoon. She had slept under a bridge the first night, curled around her satchel with the leather strap wrapped twice around her wrist so no one could take it while she slept. She had slept in the bed of an empty pickup truck the second night, parked behind an abandoned gas station somewhere between Carver and the western horizon. She drank creek water and ate dry bread purchased with her mother's coins at a roadside store where the clerk looked at her with the careful indifference reserved for people who are clearly in trouble, but not your trouble. She talked to her grandfather as she walked, not out loud and not in the way that suggests a break with reality, but in the steady internal conversation that lonely people maintain with the dead because the dead are the only ones who never interrupt and never judge. Samuel's voice was a low current in her mind, quaint and sure, carrying the particular authority of someone who has been proven right by time, even if they were not proven right by the world. Redemption Creek appeared on the prairie the way most small Kansas towns appear, as a slight interruption in the horizontal. A water tower first, then the church steeple, then the roof lines, then the buildings themselves growing slowly from the flat earth, as if reluctant to fully commit to existence. It was a town of about 200 people, 20 miles from the nearest highway, sustained by farming and a feed mill that had been operating at reduced capacity for years, in a stubbornness that is common to places that have no logical reason to continue, but continue anyway. One main street, wooden buildings with false fronts, standing shoulder to shoulder in the style of 100 years ago facades that made one-story buildings look like 2 stories, an architectural lie that had become tradition. The general store, the sheriff's office, a small white church with a steeple that leaned slightly to the east as if straining to hear something. A saloon called the Rusty Nail with a painted sign that had faded to near invisibility. A blacksmith shop, a boarding house with a porch that ran the full width of the building, and a woman standing on it who watched Callie pass without speaking. Everything was square. Every line was straight. Every building was a box of wood and nails constructed according to the same unwritten blueprint of propriety that governs small-town architecture across the entire American Midwest. Nothing curved, nothing yielded. Everything was right angles and rigid certainty, and the message of that architecture, whether its builders knew it or not, was this: we know how things should be, and we do not deviate. Callie walked through without stopping. She felt the eyes, quick glances from windows and doorways, the assessment of strangers that happens in small towns where everyone is known and the unknown is automatically suspect. She saw the faces register her appearance: young female alone, poor dirty, no car, no companion, no obvious reason to be here. She saw the conclusions being drawn. She did not care. She had been assessed and dismissed before, and the opinion of strangers had ceased to matter to her approximately 72 hours ago when her own father had pointed at the road. Past the last building, the prairie opened before her like a held breath released. Grassland rolling to the horizon in every direction, broken only by the thin line of cottonwood trees that followed the creek. And there, on a gentle rise overlooking the water, the silo. It was enormous. 12 meters tall, 6 meters in diameter, built from riveted steel plate. In the 1920s, when Redemption Creek was a stop on the railroad grain route, and the future looked like a straight line going up. The railroad had rerouted in 1938, and the silo had stood empty ever since, too expensive to demolish, too useless to maintain a monument to the unpredictability of straight lines. Rust covered every inch of its surface, deep red-brown, the color of dried blood, or old bricks, or Kansas clay after a rain. The conical roof had lost several panels, leaving gaps that showed the skeletal framework of the rafters beneath. The door, a rectangular opening at the base, had lost its door long ago and stood as a dark mouth in the curved wall, open to whatever wanted to enter. To the people of Redemption Creek, the silo was an embarrassment, a reminder of decline, an ugly thing on a pretty hill. Callie placed her hand on the curved wall. The steel was hot from the afternoon sun, rough with rust, and it vibrated under her palm with a faint, low hum that might have been the wind passing over the open top of the cylinder, or might have been something older, something that had been waiting in the metal for someone who knew what a circle meant. She felt the shape beneath her hand, the curve, the continuous arc that had no beginning and no end and no corner. She closed her eyes and stood there for a long time while the prairie wind moved her hair and the sun pressed on her back, and the town below her went about its business of not caring. Her grandfather's voice from 10 years ago, and from right here, from inside her memory, and from inside the steel, a circle has no weakness for the wind to catch. She opened her eyes. She looked up at the towering, rusted structure, against the pale sky, at its flawed and corroded skin, at the gaps in its roof and the debris spilling from its open doorway, and she saw what no one else in Redemption Creek had ever seen. Not a ruin, a beginning. She stepped inside. 3 days later, Sheriff Tom Brewer rode his brown mare up the hill, a man on official business that he wished was not his business. Tom Brewer was 52 years old and had been sheriff of Redemption Creek for 14 years, a tenure built not on excellence but on the absence of competition. Nobody else wanted the job. The pay was modest, the duties were mostly paperwork, and the only real requirement was a willingness to maintain the appearance of authority in a place where the actual authority was held by money and social consensus. Brewer was adequate. He showed up. He wore the star. He did what was expected, which is to say he upheld the existing order and left the rest alone. He was a big man going soft, sun-weathered face, brown eyes that had learned the useful trick of appearing to see everything while actually overlooking whatever was inconvenient. He was not cruel. He was not corrupt in the dramatic sense. He was simply a man who had discovered that life is easier when you do not ask difficult questions, and he had built an entire career on that discovery. He found Callie shoveling debris from the interior of the silo. She had been working since dawn. The accumulated wreckage of decades nesting material, broken wood, rusted metal scraps, dirt, animal droppings was piled outside the entrance in a growing heap. Callie was covered in grime, her clothes dark with dust, her hair tied back with a strip of fabric torn from her shirt. "Miss," Brewer did not dismount. He spoke from the saddle from a height that was both physical and social. "You cannot stay here. This is abandoned property. It is not safe." Callie paused, leaned on her makeshift shovel, a flat piece of steel lashed to a cottonwood branch with strips of leather, and looked up at him. Her face was streaked with dirt, but her eyes were clear and calm, the gray of them startling in the brown mess of her face like finding a piece of sky in the mud. "It will be," she said. "I am making it safe." "This is a grain silo," Brewer said, his voice carrying the patient weariness of a man explaining something obvious to someone who refuses to see the obvious. "Not a house. First winter storm will peel it open like a tin can. Its bones are strong." Callie placed her hand on the curved wall, a gesture that was becoming habit, a ritual of connection. "It just needs a warmer skin." Brewer looked at her and tried to fit her into a category he understood. Runaway, vagrant, troubled girl. Each label brought with it a protocol, a set of responses he had used before. But something in her calm, in the directness of her gray eyes, in the steady, unhurried way she spoke, resisted every label he tried to attach. She was not behaving like a person in crisis. She was behaving like a person at work. "There is a room at Maggie Fenn's boarding house. Clean bed, hot meals. When the circuit judge comes through next month, we can sort out a proper arrangement, a respectable situation." Thank you, Sheriff, but my place is here. He stared at her for a long moment. The wind moved across the hilltop and the silo hummed softly, that low sound it made when the air was right. Then Brewer shook his head, the slow headshake of a man who has encountered a force he cannot move and has decided to walk around it, and turned his mare back toward town. On the ride down the hill, he stopped once and looked back. Callie was already shoveling again. The rhythm of her work was steady, metrical, like the ticking of a clock that had decided to measure time in something other than hours. That girl will not survive, October Brewer thought. Then he rode on and put her out of his mind, which was a thing he was very good at doing with problems that did not fit neatly into his authority. The word reached every ear in Redemption Creek within 48 hours. Mrs. Dorothy Hale received it first because Mrs. Dorothy Hale received everything first. She was 58, the widow of Charles Hale, who had owned the only bank in town before the bank closed, and she had converted the social capital of that marriage into a position of unassailable influence. She organized the Wednesday tea. She led the Women's Church Auxiliary. She decided through a complex system of approvals and exclusions, communicated entirely in glances and slight adjustments of tone, who belonged in Redemption Creek and who did not. Dorothy's authority was not given. It was manufactured day by day through the careful accumulation of obligation and the strategic deployment of judgment. She was not a cruel woman in the way that cruelty implies pleasure. She was a frightened woman who had discovered that the most reliable defense against the chaos of the world was control, and the most effective form of control was the ability to define what was normal. Anyone who fell outside her definition was a threat not to the community, but to the architecture of certainty that kept Dorothy standing upright. Living in a rusty can, she declared in the general store on Thursday morning, her voice calibrated to reach every corner. Mixing mud pies with her bare hands like a child. It is a disgrace, and it reflects on all of us if we tolerate it. The women nodded. Martha, the blacksmith's wife, Ellen, the saloon owner's wife, Agnes, the pastor's wife. Their faces were identical expressions of concerned disapproval masks that hid the small pleasure that comes from having someone to look down on. A shared target of scorn is the cheapest glue a community has, and Redemption Creek, like all small towns, needed its glue. Cody Walsh, 20 years old, son of the biggest rancher in the county, took the entertainment further. He rode up to the silo with two friends on a Saturday afternoon and watched Callie from horseback as she hauled buckets of clay from the creek. "Building a nest, little bird," he shouted, his voice carrying the casual cruelty that comes from never having been denied anything. "Crows will have it by winter." Callie did not turn around. She continued treading straw into the clay mixture with her bare feet rhythmic, and focused her movements, as steady as if Cody and his friends were wind or birdsong, part of the environment, rather than a threat. Her silence was more unsettling than any retort, and Cody felt it. He laughed again, louder to fill the space her silence had created, but the laughter rang false even to his own ears, and he rode away sooner than he had planned. Pastor John Whitfield addressed the situation from the pulpit on Sunday. "Let us pray for those who have lost their way," he said, "and seek the path back to a proper life." He did not name Callie. He did not need to. Whitfield was a man who had built his career on the ability to say precisely what his congregation wanted to hear, and what they wanted to hear was that the girl on the hill was wrong and they were right. It was a comfortable sermon. It cost nothing and changed nothing, which is the defining characteristic of comfortable sermons. Only Nora Hale, 17, standing behind her mother in the general store, failed to nod when the chorus of disapproval rose. She looked through the window toward the hill, toward the silo, and in her eyes was something her mother would have called dangerous if she had been paying attention. And 6 miles upstream, Walt Finch sat on the creek bank and watched the small figure on the hill haul another bucket of clay up the slope. 15 trips today. He had been counting. Next to the girl, a thin dog with ribs like a washboard trotted back and forth, and even from this distance, Walt could see that the bee was watching the girl the way dogs watch people they have decided to follow. Walt had observed her every day for 2 weeks now. He saw the rhythm of her work, the way she paused to touch the wall before beginning each new task, the patience that governed her movements. He saw no madness, he saw purpose. And he recognized it the way a musician recognizes music in a language he does not speak, not by understanding the words, but by feeling the structure beneath them. He did not go to her, not yet, because Walt understood something about solitude that most people do not. Solitude is not a void that needs to be filled. It is a space where certain kinds of work can only be done alone, and interrupting that work, even with kindness, can be a form of harm. But he was watching, and in the watching was the beginning of something neither of them could yet name. In the second week, Callie learned what it meant to be truly alone. The days were long and physically punishing, but the days had purpose, and purpose is a painkiller more effective than anything in a pharmacy. It was the nights that nearly destroyed her. The silo in those early weeks was just a metal shell, uncovered, uninsulated, its interior a cathedral of echoing darkness. The concrete floor held the cold of the earth beneath it and radiated that cold upward through whatever Callie laid on it, which in those first nights was nothing more than her own body in a single thin jacket. She would lie on the concrete and look up through the gaps in the roof at the stars, which were brilliant and merciless in the Kansas sky, and she would feel the cold seeping into her bones, and she would feel the ache in her muscles from 12 hours of digging and hauling and kneading, and she would feel the cracked skin on her hands where the alkaline clay had eaten through the epidermis like slow acid, and she would feel the weight of every eye that had looked through her in town, and the weight of her father's last words, and the weight of the silence that followed. And all of those weights together would settle on her chest like a stone slab, and she would have to remind herself to breathe. She thought about her grandfather, not the lessons, not the drawings, not the technical knowledge. She thought about his hands, the size of them, the warmth, the way they had cupped her small hands when she was 8 years old and guided them into the wet clay, showing her the pressure and the angle, the way they had rested on her head when she fell asleep on his lap in the workshop, heavy and sure and absolutely safe. She had no one's hands now. She had her own, and they were cracked and bleeding and not large enough for the work ahead. On a night in the second week, lying on the concrete in the dark, Callie cried. Silently, without sound. The tears ran sideways from her eyes into her hair because she was on her back and she tasted salt at the corners of her mouth, and she let it happen because holding it back required a strength she had exhausted hours ago. She cried for Samuel, for the afternoons in his workshop, for the smell of clay and pipe tobacco, for a time when someone in the world believed she was exactly right. She cried for her mother, for the embrace that felt like holding smoke, for the whispered name of a town she had never heard of, for the cloth pouch with its $40 of silent love. She cried for herself, for the part of her that was still 18, still a child, still waiting for someone to tell her she could stop now she had proven her point. She could come home. But there was no home. That was the fact at the center of everything, the stone in the river around which all the water had to flow. Then something moved in the darkness, a soft padding on concrete, a presence that displaced the empty air beside her, warm breath on her cheek smelling of prairie grass and dust. The stray she had seen around the silo for days, watching from a distance, cautious ribs showing through dull fur. He had finally closed the gap. He lay down beside her on the concrete, pressed his body against hers, and put his head on his paws. Callie placed her hand on his back. She felt the knobs of his spine beneath the thin fur, the slight tremor in his muscles, the warmth that radiated from his living body into her cold hand. He was not warm enough to stop the shivering, but he was warm enough to prove she was not the only abandoned creature on this hill. Dust, she whispered. Your name is Dust, because you came from the earth, same as me. The dog sighed, a long, deep exhalation that carried the sound of surrender. Not the bad kind, but the good kind, the kind where you stop running and let the place you have found become the place you stay. They slept, two discarded creatures on a concrete floor in a rusted metal cylinder on a hill above a town that did not want either of them. And in the morning, Callie woke with the dog still beside her, and she knew with a certainty that went deeper than thought that she would not quit. She would not quit because quitting would mean Samuel was wrong. And Samuel was not wrong, the earth was not wrong, the circle was not wrong, and she would prove it not with words, because words had never saved anyone in her family, but with her hands in the dirt beneath them. On the hilltop in the early light, Walt Finch's fishing line went tight, and he did not notice. He was watching the girl emerge from the silo with the dog beside her, watching her stretch her arms against the sunrise, watching her pick up the makeshift shovel and begin another day. Well then, he said to the creek, well then. He reeled in the fish without looking at it and went home to sharpen his good shovel. He did not know why, not yet. The work began in earnest in the third week when the silo was clean and the concrete floor was bare, and the only thing left inside was the smell of earth and the echo of Callie's footsteps and the sound of Dust's toenails clicking as he followed her from wall to wall. She fell into a rhythm that governed every hour of every day, a rhythm as strict and as sustaining as a heartbeat. Before dawn wake, drink water from the creek cupped in her hands, cold and tasting of stone. Walk 300 meters down the slope to the creek bed where the best clay waited beneath a thin layer of sand and gravel. The good clay was red-orange, fine-grained, the consistency of cold butter when wet. It lay about 12 inches below the surface, a seam of it running along the inside bend of the creek, where the slow water had deposited it over centuries. Dig. Fill the wooden bucket, a grain measure she had found in the silo debris. 20 kilograms per load. Carry it up the hill, set it down, walk back down, dig, fill, carry. 15 to 20 trips a day, each trip 15 minutes, each bucket 20 kilograms. 300 to 400 kilograms of raw clay hauled uphill every day by a girl who weighed 54 kilograms and had to stop 3 times on each ascent to rest her burning shoulders and her screaming calves. The first problem she encountered nearly ended the project before it began. The interior surface of the silo was smooth, riveted steel. She mixed her cob the way she remembered from Samuel's workshop, approximately 3 parts clay, 1 part dry grass cut short with a knife she had fashioned from a piece of scrap metal water, enough to make the mixture pliable. She pressed it against the wall with her palms, leaning her weight into it, willing it to hold. It slid off, every time. The clay clung for a heartbeat long enough to spark hope, and then the weight of it overcame the friction, and it peeled away from the smooth steel and hit the floor with a wet, slapping sound that became the most demoralizing noise in Callie's world. She tried throwing it hard. It stuck for 10 seconds and fell. She tried thin layers. They dried and flaked off like sunburned skin. She tried scoring the steel with a nail, roughing up the surface. Marginal improvement. Not enough. 4 days of carrying clay up the hill and watching gravity win every time. On the 5th evening, she sat on the concrete floor and stared at the pile of failed cob at her feet and felt the hope that had been sustaining her since she first touched the curved wall begin to thin and fade like light through closing curtains. Then a memory surfaced, not a technique, a moment. She was 8 years old in Samuel's workshop, watching him prepare a wooden board for plastering. He was driving small nails into the wood, not flush, but leaving each nail head protruding about ½ an inch, hundreds of tiny metal fingers reaching out from the surface. When he applied the plaster, it gripped those nail heads and held fast. The next morning, Callie scavenged the debris field around the silo. She collected every nail, bolt, screw, staple, and bent piece of wire she could find. Rusted, bent, mismatched, it did not matter. She began driving them into the interior wall of the silo one at a time, using a hammer made from a flat creek stone lashed to a cottonwood branch. Not deep, just enough to anchor, each nail head protruding about 1 centimeter. Tap, tap, tap. 50 nails on a good day when the stone did not crack and her hand did not blister too badly. Where she ran out of nails, she improvised. Salvaged wire from old fencing outside town was cut into lengths and woven into rough crosshatch grids fastened to the wall with the few remaining nails, creating a mesh skeleton for the cob to grip. She had seen this principle at work every day of her life without knowing its name. Grassroots hold soil on a creek bank. Straw fibers hold clay in a cob wall. Wire mesh holds plaster on a steel surface. Tension and compression working together, the same principle that engineers call reinforcement and that nature calls survival. With anchor points in place, the cob held. The first patch she applied on the 6th day of the new method stayed on the wall overnight. She woke and touched it in the gray morning light. Cool, firm, gripping the steel through the web of wire and nail, heads like fingers laced together. She pressed harder, testing. The cob did not flex, did not shift. It was bonded to the wall as securely as if it had grown there. She stood in the dim light of the silo with her hand on that rough square of earth and felt her grandfather's presence so strongly that she almost turned around to look for him. But the silo was empty except for Dust, who was watching from the doorway, with his head tilted and the morning light slanting through the gaps in the roof, casting bright lines across the concrete floor. The next step was applying full sections, floor to the point where she could reach, working in vertical strips about 2 feet wide, building the cob in layers. Each layer was 3 to 4 inches thick, pressed firmly into the anchor points, and smoothed with the flat of her palm until the surface was continuous. She could complete about one strip per day if the clay was already mixed, which meant mixing had to happen the day before, which meant every evening after the application work was done, she would kneel beside the mixing pit outside the silo and knead the next day's batch with her bare feet. A rhythmic rocking motion that worked the straw fibers evenly through the clay, the way a baker works flour into dough, except that this dough weighed several hundred pounds and fought back. The straw was critical. It functions in cob the way steel rebar functions in concrete. The clay provides compressive strength resistance to being crushed. The straw provides tensile strength resistance to being pulled apart. Together, they create a composite material stronger than either component alone. Too little straw in the cob is brittle cracking as it dries because the clay shrinks and there are not enough fibers to hold it together. Too much straw in the mix is spongy, unable to compact into a dense thermal mass. The ratio Callie was trying to find by trial and error from a child's imperfect memory was somewhere around 1 part straw to 3 parts clay by volume, but the exact number depended on variables she did not yet know how to measure. Each layer needed 3 to 4 days to dry before the next could be applied. Wet cob applied over cob that had not fully cured would compress the soft layer beneath, squeezing out moisture and creating a weak plane between the two that would eventually separate and fall. Patience was not optional. It was structural. During the drying days, she worked on other tasks, gathering flat sandstone from the creek bed for the hearth, selecting pieces with even faces, and carrying them up the hill in a canvas sling she had made from old tarpaulin. Cutting and drying prairie grass for straw, spreading it in thin layers on the south-facing slope where the sun was strongest. Repairing the silo roof by climbing the exterior on handholds she had bolted into the steel, replacing missing panels with flattened scrap metal sealed with cob at the seams. She was never idle. Every minute had a purpose, and her body was transforming under the labor. Shoulders broadened, arms developed the ropey definition that comes not from a gym, but from hauling real weight up real hills. Her hands became calloused instruments covered in permanent red clay that no scrubbing could remove. She moved with the stripped economy of someone who has learned to optimize every gesture because waste is a luxury she cannot afford. But the ratio was wrong. She knew it from the cracks. Hairline fractures appearing in every section after it dried too many and too deep, spreading through the surface like veins in a leaf. If the entire wall cracked like this, the insulation value would be halved and the structural integrity compromised. She adjusted. More water, still cracked, more straw, different cracks, wider gaps, less straw, tighter cracks, but deeper, running all the way through to the steel. 3 weeks of mixing and testing and failing and remixing, working from a child's memory that was rich in sensation but poor in precision. Then on an evening in the 6th week, hands raw and back aching, she sat in the silo and reached into her satchel for a rag to wipe the clay from her face. Her fingers brushed something hard beneath the worn leather lining at the bottom of the bag. Something rectangular, something that had no reason to be there. She tore the lining open. The notebook, brown leather, soft, wrapped in oilcloth. On the cover in faded pencil, S. Reed field notes. She opened it. The first page stopped her breathing. Blue ink, her mother's handwriting. 7 words that rearranged the architecture of everything Callie understood about her family. For my daughter. Build what he dreamed. The rest of the notebook was 200 pages of Samuel Reed's life work. Diagrams, formulas, observations. 30 years of experimentation distilled into a field manual for building with earth. 5 classifications of clay based on mineral content, each with specific cob ratios. Testing methods she could perform with nothing but her hands and a 1-hour wait. And there on page 87, the solution to the cracking problem, written in Samuel's careful hand: add small quantity dried horse manure, contains partially decomposed grass fiber, much finer than straw, creates microbonding throughout mixture. Pueblo builders taught me this. Do not laugh. It works better than any commercial additive. Callie laughed, a small, shaking, involuntary sound closer to a gasp than humor. Dust lifted his head and thumped his tail once at the unfamiliar noise. She turned to the back of the notebook and found the drawing that changed everything. A floor plan marked with a rusted paperclip. A grain silo converted into a dwelling. Beside it, Redemption Creek, Kansas. Silo east side of hill. Ideal structure. Good concrete foundation. Near water and clay deposits. Will visit when opportunity allows. Dated 1952. Samuel had known about this silo. He had planned this conversion. He had died 4 years later without making the trip. But Mary had known. Mary had memorized the name of the town and held it for 20 years and whispered it to her daughter on the last night, and she had hidden the notebook in the satchel so that when Callie arrived, she would have everything she needed to build what Samuel had dreamed. 3 generations. One circle, finally closing. The horse manure worked. Callie gathered it from the open prairie where it lay in dried patties, crumbled it into the cob mixture, and applied a fresh section. 3 days later, it dried smooth and solid and continuous. She ran her palm over the surface and felt warmth, felt density, felt the particular satisfaction of a material that has found its correct form. From that day, the work accelerated and the silo began to change. While Callie built, someone was helping. Every few mornings, she would emerge from the silo at dawn to find a small basket sitting on the ground outside the door. Inside, fresh bread, butter wrapped in cloth, sometimes an apple, sometimes a beeswax candle. Never a note, never a trace of the person who had climbed the hill in the dark and left it there and vanished before the light could reveal them. Callie did not investigate. She understood instinctively that whoever was helping her was taking a significant risk. In a town like Redemption Creek, where Dorothy Hale's opinion functioned as law, showing kindness to the outcast was itself an act of rebellion. To expose her benefactor would be to punish the only person who had treated her as human. She accepted the baskets the way she accepted the creek water and the prairie grass, as gifts from the world that required no repayment and no acknowledgement. Only gratitude carried quietly the way lonely people carry all their heaviest things. It was Nora Hale, Dorothy's 17-year-old daughter, slipping out the back door before first light, taking the long way around behind the town, climbing the hill, placing the basket, running home before her mother's alarm clock rang at 6:15. Each trip took 15 minutes. 15 minutes when Nora Hale was not her mother's daughter, not the girl in the approved dress speaking the approved words and dreaming the approved dreams. 15 minutes of radical simplicity, a person helping another person. Nothing more. And that nothing more was the most extravagant thing Nora had ever experienced, because in Dorothy Hale's house, everything was more. More propriety, more caution, more performance. The absence of more was a freedom Nora had not known existed. In the 12th week, with nearly 3/4 of the interior wall covered in smooth, dense cob, the silo was becoming something other than what it had been. The hollow metallic echo was gone, replaced by a thick, absorbing quiet. Sound behaved differently inside the earthen walls. It was rounder, softer. The air carried a faint scent of clay and dried grass, the smell of a root cellar or an old adobe mission, cool and ancient and safe. Then one moonlit night, dust woke her with a bark she had never heard before. Sharp, urgent, the bark he saved for real threats. She lay still, footsteps outside, multiple sets, muffled laughter. Then a heavy impact against the outer wall that shook dirt from the ceiling and sent a vibration through the floor that she felt in her spine. She ran outside. Moonlight, 3 figures sprinting down the hill. She could not see their faces, but she could see the shapes, and she knew. Cody Walsh, the 2 friends who followed him everywhere because following Cody was easier than having a personality. The damage was significant. A section of the exterior cob, the protective outer layer she had recently begun applying, had been smashed away. Chunks of it lay scattered on the grass, broken, formless, weeks of labor reduced to rubble. Worse water had been poured over the surrounding cob. She could see the wet stains spreading in the moonlight, moisture soaking into clay that had not fully cured, weakening the molecular bonds that held it together. If she did not repair it before the next rain, the water would penetrate deeper. The interior cob would soften. Sections would separate from the steel and fall. Months of work undone by a boy with a hammer and a bucket and a certainty that things he did not understand deserved to be destroyed. Callie stood in front of the broken wall and felt something she had not felt before. Not anger exactly. Emptiness. The kind that comes when you have invested everything you have into something and someone casually, almost playfully, takes a piece of it and throws it on the ground. She sat down in the dirt. Dust pressed his head into her lap. She put both hands in his fur and stared at the broken cob and the moonlit prairie beyond it, and felt the familiar structure of her resolve begin to shift beneath her. the way a foundation shifts when the ground under it turns out to be less solid than you believed. The next morning, Sheriff Brewer came. He had heard Cody talking at the saloon. He saw the damage. He saw the horseshoe prints in the soft earth and recognized them because he had shod those horses himself. He looked at Callie. She was standing in front of the damaged wall arms at her sides, face-neutral eyes, holding nothing that he could use or deflect. "I will look into it," he said. His voice was flat, a line delivered without conviction, the verbal equivalent of a check written on an account with no funds. He turned his horse and left. There might have been a moment of hesitation. There might have been a flicker of something that in a better man would have become action. But the moment passed, and so did he. That night, Callie opened Samuel's notebook. Not for engineering, for company. She turned pages slowly, reading the marginal notes, the personal asides scattered among the technical drawings. Near the back, beside a sketch of a round house, she found this in handwriting, slightly less steady than usual. "They destroyed the third model today. Boys from town, middle of the night. I will rebuild tomorrow morning. The fourth attempt is always better than the third." Samuel, her grandfather. The same story, the same destruction, the same stubbornness in the morning after. Before dawn, she stepped outside. The basket was there. Bread, butter, and a roll of oilcloth waterproof fabric enough to cover the damaged section and protect it from rain. Someone had seen. Someone still cared. Callie covered the wall, mixed clay, started again. The rebuilt section took 6 days. It was thicker than before, denser, better, as if destruction had been a teacher more effective than success. 2 days after the vandalism, Callie was kneading clay outside the silo when she heard footsteps in the grass. Slow, heavy, deliberate. The footsteps of an old man who has walked long distances for so many years that his body has forgotten how to hurry. Walt Finch stood before her. He did not say hello. He did not explain his presence. He did not ask if she needed help. He was carrying a shovel, a real shovel steel blade oak handle, the kind of tool that costs money and lasts a lifetime, and that Callie had never possessed. He looked at the repaired wall, looked at the pile of raw clay, drove the shovel into the clay, and began to work. Callie watched him for 10 seconds. 20. Walt did not look up. He mixed clay with the steady mechanical efficiency of a man whose body has performed this type of labor for so long that his muscles do not require instructions from his brain. Shovel in, twist, lift, turn, a rhythm as natural as breathing. She picked up her own tools and went back to work. They worked side by side without a word for 4 hours. The sun crossed the sky. Dust lay in the shade of the silo and watched them with the calm disinterest of a creature who has decided that humans are fundamentally strange but occasionally useful. At noon, Walt stopped, sat in the shade, drank from a dented canteen. Callie sat a few meters away. The distance was deliberate on both sides, the respectful gap that solitary people maintain, because they understand that closeness is something you earn slowly, like trust, like a good cob wall. Walt studied the interior of the silo, the finished sections where the cob gleamed smooth and dense in the filtered light. He reached out and pressed his palm against the surface, held it there, nodded once. Then he spoke. His first words. "How thick?" "About 10 inches at the thickest. I want 12. 12 is good. 16 would be better, but too heavy for this slab." He looked at the concrete foundation. "Good pour, though. 20s era. They used more cement in the mix back then." A silence that was not uncomfortable because neither of them needed to fill it. "Who taught you?" Walt asked, his tone as casual as if he were asking about the weather. "My grandfather." Walt nodded. He did not ask for details. He understood that some things are transmitted not through explanation, but through proximity, through shared labor, through the silent transfer that happens when an old pair of hands guides a young pair of hands into the clay. They worked through the afternoon. Walt was stronger than his frame suggested. 71 years of trapping and chopping and hauling and building had laid down muscle in his arms and back that age had thinned but not removed. He handled the shovel with an economy of motion that made Callie's own movements look wasteful by comparison, and she watched him when he was not looking and adjusted her technique accordingly. There was a language in the way Walt worked that Callie recognized from her grandfather's workshop, the language of a man who has done physical labor so long that his body and the tool have merged into a single system. Walt did not think about the shovel. He did not plan each stroke. The shovel was an extension of his arms, the way a good pen is an extension of a writer's mind, and the clay responded to his handling with a fluidity that surprised Callie. He could feel the mixture's readiness through the blade. Too wet, and he would add a handful of dry straw without being told. Too stiff, and he would sprinkle water from his canteen with a precision that suggested he had been mixing earth for decades, which Callie realized he probably had in ways she did not yet know about. They fell into a rhythm that required no coordination because it was the same rhythm two people tuned to the same frequency of labor. Callie kneading and mixing, Walt shoveling and transporting. Both applying cob to the wall, working side by side, their hands sometimes close enough to touch, but never touching, maintaining the respectful distance that solitary people preserve because they understand that proximity is earned, not assumed. At one point in the early afternoon, Walt stopped and examined a section of wall that Callie had finished the previous week. He ran his fingers along the surface, pressed his palm flat, closed his eyes. He was feeling the wall the way a doctor feels a patient reading information through his skin that his eyes could not provide. When he opened his eyes, he nodded. Not at Callie, at the wall, an acknowledgement of quality directed at the work itself, which was a compliment more meaningful than any praise directed at the worker. Callie saw this and felt something loosen in her chest, a knot she had not known was there. The knot that forms when you are doing something that no one around you understands, and you begin to wonder if understanding is possible. Walt understood. He did not need to say so. His hand said it. His nod said it. The fact that he came back day after day with his shovel and his silence said it louder than any words. When the light began to fail, Walt straightened, pressed both hands into the small of his back, and brushed the clay from his trousers. "I will come back day after tomorrow," he said. Like scheduling breakfast. He came, and he kept coming. Not every day. Walt maintained his own life in his cabin, 6 miles upstream, running his trap lines, fishing the creek, living the quiet existence that had sustained him for 2 decades. But every second or third day, he appeared on the hilltop with his shovel, and they worked, mostly in silence. Occasionally a sentence. "Clay at the North Bend is finer. I will try it. Dog is filling out. He eats better than I do." Walt touching a finished section, good surface, smooth. Their friendship was built the way the wall was built, one thin layer at a time, each layer needing time to set before the next could be applied. No rushing, no declarations, no need for the performative rituals of human connection. Just two people alone in different ways finding in shared work a bridge they could both stand on. One afternoon, resting in the shade, Walt said, "My wife died 23 years ago, Helen. She could read clouds better than me. I never got a weather forecast wrong when she was alive. Since she passed, I have been wrong at least twice a year." He said it without sadness. The way you describe a landscape feature that has always been there. The creek bends here, the hill rises there. Helen is gone. Facts that shape the terrain of a life without needing to be mourned every time they are mentioned. Callie understood. Walt was not sharing grief. He was sharing coordinates, telling her where he stood in the geography of loneliness so she would know they were in the same country. The discovery came not in a dramatic confrontation, but in the quiet way that small towns discover things through accumulation and inference, and the fact that Dorothy Hale woke up at 5:45 instead of 6:15 on a Thursday morning because her hip was aching. She saw Nora leaving through the back door, followed her at a distance, watched her climb the hill with a basket, watched her set it down at the silo door, watched her turn and run back toward town. The confrontation was waiting for Nora in the kitchen, Dorothy at the table, arms folded, face arranged in an expression that Nora had seen deployed against countless targets over the years, but never against herself. "You have been feeding that creature on the hill." Nora stood in the doorway. The guilt hit first and then surprising both of them, something that was not guilt at all. "She is a person mother. She is hungry and she is alone. She chose to be alone. She chose to live like an animal in a can. She is building a home." Nora's voice was steady, which surprised her. "With her hands, every single day. I have never seen anyone work that hard." The words landed on Dorothy like a slap, not because they were angry, but because they were true, and because truth in Dorothy's world was an uncontrolled substance that needed to be managed. Dorothy had never built anything with her hands. Her entire position was inherited social abstract. The girl on the hill was making something real from mud and muscle, which was more tangible creation than Dorothy had accomplished in 58 years of respectable existence. Dorothy confined Nora to the house. The basket stopped appearing at the silo door. Callie noticed the absence and understood that someone had been caught and someone was being punished for the crime of kindness. Dorothy, her private wound converted into public weapon with the efficiency of long practice, intensified her campaign. In the women's auxiliary, at the general store, after church, the silo girl became not just a nuisance but a symbol of everything wrong with a world that tolerated deviation. The week shortened, autumn arrived, the cottonwood leaves along the creek turned gold, then brown, then flew away on winds that carried an edge they had not carried before. One evening in mid-October, Walt and Callie sat outside the silo. The work was nearly done. 12 inches of cob lined the interior. The stone hearth was built a masterpiece of Flat Creek sandstone fitted and mortared with dense clay, the rocket stove design from Samuel's notebook realized in 3 dimensions. The chimney flue, a channel built into the cob wall, spiraled upward through the earthen mass before venting through a sealed opening in the roof. The heavy oak door hung on leather hinges. Every gap was sealed. The hearth had taken 3 weeks on its own. Callie had selected each stone by hand from the creek bed, looking for pieces with at least one flat face, testing each one by tapping it with a smaller stone and listening to the ring. A clear, high ring meant dense stone good for holding heat. A dull thud meant porous stone that would crack when exposed to repeated heating and cooling cycles. She rejected more stones than she kept filling the canvas sling again and again, carrying the chosen ones up the hill and arranging them in the pattern Samuel had drawn, a pattern she now understood was not arbitrary, but was designed so that the mass of stone directly behind the firebox was thickest, absorbing the most heat while the stones on either side tapered thinner, directing the warm air toward the flue entrance. The rocket stove itself was an ingenious piece of engineering disguised as simplicity, a small combustion chamber barely large enough to hold 3 or 4 pieces of split wood fed by a narrow air intake at the base. The narrow opening forced the incoming air into a fast stream that hit the burning wood at high velocity, creating a hotter, more complete combustion than a conventional fireplace. The result was more heat from less wood and almost no smoke, because smoke is just unburned fuel, and the rocket stove burned nearly everything. The chimney was the true innovation. Instead of rising straight up through the roof, it ran horizontally through the cob wall for about 8 feet before turning upward, a long S-curve embedded in the earthen mass. The hot exhaust gases traveling through this channel heated the surrounding cob from inside, turning a section of the wall into a thermal radiator. By the time the gases reached the exterior vent, they had surrendered most of their heat to the building itself. Samuel had calculated in a margin note that this design captured roughly 60% more thermal energy than a conventional straight chimney. Looking at the numbers in the notebook, Callie understood why her grandfather had been so passionate about this approach. It was not just efficient, it was elegant. It treated heat as a resource to be used fully rather than a byproduct to be vented away. Walt was looking north. He had been looking north for several minutes. His pale eyes narrowed, reading something in the sky that could not be seen, only sensed the way a fisherman reads the water, not by what is visible on the surface, but by what the surface tells him about what is happening below. The north wind is singing a different song this year. His voice was low, measured. An old song, a hungry one. Callie waited. The geese left 2 weeks early. Squirrels are burying deeper than I have seen in 71 years on this dirt. He paused. I remember the winter of '36, killed cattle standing up in the fields, froze them solid where they stood. The sky before that storm looked like this, almost. This year it looks worse. He turned to her. Direct, no decoration. Whatever you are doing here, finish it. The sky is holding its breath. When it lets go, it will be a scream. He gave her the nod, their nod, the brief inclination of the head that had come to mean everything that their few words could not, and walked away. That night, Callie lit the first fire in the stone hearth. The effect was immediate and startling, not like the sudden heat of an open flame, but like being enveloped, surrounded, held. The chimney flue carried hot air through the thick cob wall, warming the earthen mass from inside, and the wall absorbed that heat and released it back into the room in a slow, steady, gentle radiation that touched every surface equally. No cold spots, no drafts, just warmth deep and pervasive, as if the room itself were alive and breathing warm air. Dust moved to the hearth and lay down inside, a sound of such profound contentment that Callie stopped what she was doing and simply listened. It was the sound of a creature experiencing comfort for the first time. It was the sound of a body that had only known concrete and cold ground discovering that the world could be soft. She sat on her straw bed and held Samuel's notebook against her chest and closed her eyes. The next afternoon, the sky changed color. The familiar blue-gray of late autumn shifted to yellow, then to a bruised purple that drained the landscape of all its natural hues. The grass turned gray. The buildings in town turned gray. The world became a photograph left in the rain. Then the wind died. Not gradually, not in gusts that diminished. It stopped, completely, as if a switch had been thrown. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was predatory. The silence of a large animal drawing a slow breath before the strike. Dust raised his head. Every hair on his back stood straight. Callie stood in the doorway and looked north. The horizon was moving. A wall of white reaching from the ground to the upper atmosphere was advancing across the Great Plains with a speed that made her stomach cold. She stepped inside, closed the oak door, dropped the iron bar into its brackets, added wood to the fire, sat down on her straw bed with her hand on the dog, and waited. The storm did not arrive. It detonated. There is no adequate comparison for what descended upon Redemption Creek that night. The language of weather was designed for weather, and this was not weather. This was geology. This was the planet reminding every living thing on the Kansas prairie that it existed at the pleasure of forces so vast and so indifferent that human concepts like shelter and safety and home were nothing more than polite fictions maintained during the intervals between demonstrations of actual power. A polar vortex had collapsed over the Canadian Arctic and sent a river of air so cold it belonged to a different ice age screaming south across the Great Plains with nothing to impede it. No mountain ranges, no forests, no terrain features of any kind between the frozen north and the flatlands of Kansas. The air mass collided with moisture surging up from the Gulf of Mexico, and the impact created a storm that was less a weather event than a physical assault, a blizzard that moved not vertically but horizontally, a solid wall of white traveling at speeds that turned snowflakes into projectiles and cold into a predator. Wind speed exceeded 75 miles per hour, sustained with gusts above 100. Temperature dropped from 23 degrees Fahrenheit to 31 below zero in under 2 hours. Wind chill, the calculation that describes how fast exposed flesh freezes, reached 67 below. At that number, frostbite begins in 30 seconds, unconsciousness in 5 minutes, death in 20. The snow did not fall from the sky. It flew parallel to the ground so thick and so fast that the concept of visibility became meaningless. Step outside and you were blind instantly, surrounded by a white roar that eliminated direction, eliminated distance, eliminated everything except the sensation of ice traveling at highway speed against every exposed inch of your body, and the sound that was not a howl or a whistle, but a continuous low-frequency roar that you heard not with your ears, but with your skeleton. In Redemption Creek, the storm found what it was looking for. Right angles, flat surfaces, sharp corners, the architectural vocabulary of order and convention, and the belief that straight lines represent strength. It slammed into the flat face of the general store, and the building caught the full force of the wind like a sail, the pressure differential between the windward side and the leeward side creating a suction effect that lifted and pulled. The wind found the gap between roof and wall, a gap no wider than a pencil, and forced itself through. The roof peeled back with a sound like the world tearing. Timbers that had been nailed and braced snapped like matchsticks. The entire roof structure sailed into the darkness and vanished. The church steeple, the tallest point in town, the structure that Pastor Whitfield climbed every Sunday to ring the bell that called his flock to order, caught the wind and began to oscillate. The frequency of oscillation matched some resonant property of the wood, and the movement amplified itself with each cycle until the steeple snapped at its base with a report like artillery fire and crashed through the roof, taking half the building with it. Whitfield and his wife crouched in the wreckage snow pouring through the open ceiling, and the pastor discovered that certainty is a feeling, not a fact, and that feelings do not keep out the cold. The sheriff's office symbol of law and order cracked and groaned and surrendered its windows to the pressure. Tom Brewer threw his body against the front door as the frame splintered around him. Snow screamed through the shattered glass, and within minutes, the temperature inside dropped to match the lethal cold outside. The building that represented his authority was coming apart around him, and there was nothing he could do about it. And in that helplessness was a truth more honest than any he had encountered in 14 years of carrying a badge. In her fine parlor, Dorothy Hale heard the crack that separated her life into before and after. The main support beam in her ceiling, a timber that had held the weight of the roof without complaint for decades, failed. The combined load of accumulated snow and the relentless lateral pressure of wind gusting above 100 miles per hour exceeded the capacity of the wood at its weakest point, a knot in the grain that had been invisible for years, and the beam split. The ceiling opened. Ice and darkness poured into the room, burying the fire, extinguishing the lamp, filling the space with a chaos of cold and noise that was the precise opposite of everything Dorothy had spent her life constructing. She screamed, but the storm consumed the sound 3 feet from her lips. Upstairs, Nora felt the floor lurch and ran down to find her mother on her knees in the ruins of the parlor, surrounded by broken furniture and wet books and shattered porcelain, her hair wild with snow, her face a mask of terror so complete that Nora did not recognize her. The woman who had controlled everything is kneeling in the wreckage of her control, and the sight of it erased every hierarchy between mother and daughter as completely as the storm was erasing the town. On the hill inside the circle, there was calm. The wind met the curved wall of the silo and found no purchase, no flat surface to push against, no corner to exploit, no angle to leave her open. The force distributed itself evenly around the entire circumference, and at every point the wall said the same thing: you cannot concentrate your strength here. Move on. The wind, which was not intelligent, but which obeyed the physics of fluid dynamics as faithfully as water obeys gravity, did what curves have always forced wind to do. It flowed around and continued. The cob wall, 12 inches of clay and straw and earth, absorbed the sound of the storm, the way a heavy curtain absorbs light. The roar of destruction raging outside became a low, distant, muffled hum inside the silo, a vibration felt through the soles of the feet rather than heard through the ears. The stone hearth radiated steady warmth at 60 degrees. The chimney flue heated the cob wall from within, and the wall held that heat and returned it to the room in a slow, continuous radiation that was not like the heat of a fire, which has direction and intensity, but like the heat of a living body, which simply is. Callie sat on her straw bed with one hand on Dust, who slept undisturbed. The lantern cast amber light on the smooth curved walls, on the provisions stacked neatly along the base, on the thick oak door that held back the apocalypse as easily as it held back a breeze. She was not afraid. She was listening to the world trying to destroy itself on the other side of her walls, and she felt not triumph, but the deep, steady, ancient satisfaction of a person who has listened to the earth and been answered. The first knock came after midnight, faint, then frantic, the rhythm of a human hand hitting wood in the final minutes before the body begins shutting down. She lifted the bar. The door opened, and the storm entered the room like a living thing, a wall of white and cold that stole her breath and coated her face in frost in the space of 2 heartbeats. And in that white violence, a human shape. Cody Walsh. Ice on his eyebrows, lips the color of a bruise, eyes holding nothing except the primal terror of a creature that knows it is dying and cannot stop it. He fell through the doorway and hit the earthen floor. Callie pulled him to the hearth, wrapped him in her blanket, the only blanket she owned, the one Maggie Fenn had given her. She added wood to the fire and said nothing. Did not look at him with satisfaction. Did not remind him that the wall he had smashed with a hammer 3 weeks ago was now the wall keeping him alive. Cody tried to speak. Roofed it was all he managed through jaws that would not stop shaking. Callie nodded. An hour later, another knock. She opened the door to Sheriff Brewer, supporting Dorothy Hale, whose frozen tears had created lines of ice down her cheeks, whose fine clothes hung in stiff tatters, whose entire public self had collapsed as thoroughly as her ceiling beam. Behind them, Nora. When the girl stepped through the doorway into the warmth and her eyes found Callie's, the two of them stood in a moment of recognition that did not require words. Nora smiled, small, trembling. Callie nodded once. Everything that needed to be said was said in those 2 gestures. Thank you, you are welcome. I know it was you, I know. Brewer's face was the face of a man who has been stripped of every comfortable fiction he ever wrapped around himself. The roofs, he said, all of them. They are gone. He paused. We saw your light. Her light. 1 lantern, 1 round room on a hill, a beacon built from madness and mud. They came in clusters after that. The blacksmith and his family, the saloon owner and his wife, Martha, Ellen, Harold, and Maggie Fenn. Maggie grasping Callie's hand at the threshold and squeezing it with a pressure that spoke 20 years of silent regret. Pastor Whitfield, last of all his black vestments, white with snow, his face emptied of every trace of the composure that had been his professional uniform. 21 people from Redemption Creek crowded into the warm circular room. Then one more knock. Near dawn with the storm at full fury, not the panicked beating of the earlier arrivals, but a deliberate pattern. 3 strikes, pause, 3 more weaker. Tom Patterson, his wife Sarah, their 6-year-old daughter Emma. From the farthest farm, their truck had died in a drift. They had been saved by a man they barely knew. "The old trapper," Tom said, his words coming in broken pieces through chattering teeth, "found us on the road, gave us his bear hide blanket, walked behind us, and used his body to break the wind from Emma. He was right behind us. Then he was not. I went back, but I could not see, could not breathe. Had to get Emma inside." Callie was through the door before the last word was finished. The cold outside was beyond description. It was not temperature, it was force. It hit her, and she went down on hands and knees, blind the ice driving into her face with the impact of thrown sand. She crawled. Dust was beside her nose to the ground, tracking what only a dog's nose could track in that white blindness. He barked, sharp, once, and veered left. She found Walt Finch lying on his side in the snow, curled inward, 30 yards from the door. He had no coat. He had given everything he had to the Patterson family, the blanket, the final reserves of a body that had survived 71 Kansas winters on stubbornness and sinew. But even stubbornness has limits, and 67 below wind chill is past all of them. She grabbed him under the arms and pulled. He was heavier than she expected because a lifetime of labor builds density in the bone and the muscle and the sinew, and that density does not diminish with age. It just settles deeper. And unconscious weight is heavier than conscious weight because the body is no longer helping carry itself. 30 yards. In normal conditions, a walk of 15 seconds. In the storm, nearly 10 minutes. Callie pulling dust, barking the direction the wind trying to push all 3 of them back into the white nothing. She came through the door backward, hauling Walt across the threshold, and Brewer and Patterson lifted him and carried him to the fire. They wrapped him in blankets. Callie placed dust against his side, the living warmth of the dog pressed along his body. Walt's hand was cold, the way stone is cold. Mineral, deep, the cold of something that has been outside for a very long time. Then his fingers moved, a slight pressure around hers. He opened his eyes. The pale blue-gray was clouded but present. He saw Callie. He did not speak. He gave her the nod, their nod, the one that said everything their few words never needed to. 26 people in the silo. The storm held the world for 4 days. Inside the circle, a new order formed. Not based on who owned what or whose family name carried weight. Based on shared catastrophe and a stone hearth and thin soup ladled by the hands of the girl they had all dismissed. The first day was silence and shock. People sat where Callie placed them, wrapped in whatever she could spare, and stared at the earthen walls with the bewildered expression of sleepers waking in an unfamiliar room. Dorothy Hale sat beside the blacksmith's wave, both wrapped in the same rough blanket, and neither acknowledged the absurdity, because absurdity was now the only reality available. Brewer helped distribute rations, 1 bowl per person. No one complained. The logistics of keeping 26 people alive in a space designed for one were considerable, and Callie managed them with the same quiet efficiency she applied to everything else. She rationed the firewood, feeding the rocket stove small pieces at carefully timed intervals to maintain a steady temperature without burning through the supply too quickly. She melted snow in a pot on the hearth for drinking water, a slow process that yielded barely enough for everyone. She cooked the dried beans in batches, 1 pot at a time, stretching her meager stores with creek water and salt into a thin soup that was not delicious, but was warm and nourishing, and for people who had been minutes from freezing to death, tasted like the finest meal of their lives. She organized sleeping in shifts because there was not floor space for everyone to lie down at once. Families with children slept near the hearth during the warmest hours. Single adults slept in the outer ring of the circular room where the cob wall radiated enough heat to keep the temperature above freezing, but not enough for true comfort. Nobody complained about the arrangement because nobody had the energy to complain, and because the alternative to discomfort was death. And that comparison has a way of making people grateful for things they would normally consider intolerable. The round shape of the room had an unexpected psychological effect. In a square room, corners create natural divisions. People gather in separate corners, and the geometry of the space reinforces separation. In a round room, there are no corners. There are no natural boundaries. Everyone faces the center where the fire burns, and the curvature of the wall behind them draws them slightly inward toward each other, the way an amphitheater draws the audience toward the stage. The architecture itself promoted community, and the people inside it, stripped of every social structure they had ever known, responded to that promotion without resistance. Walt lay near the hearth. He was conscious and occasionally lucid, but the cold had taken something from him that the warmth was not returning. His breathing was shallow, the intake accompanied by a rasp that worsened each day, the sound of lungs that had been damaged by air, cold enough to crystallize moisture in the bronchial passages. The second day, the shame arrived. It moved through the room like a change in temperature, subtle at first, and then impossible to ignore. People watched Callie tend the fire check on the children, an elderly move through her small, round home with the calm competence of someone who had prepared for exactly this. They watched her and they remembered everything. Every joke at the general store, every Sunday sermon about lost souls and proper paths, every time they had looked through her as if she were made of glass. Cody Walsh sat against the wall with his face in his hands and did not move for hours. He was thinking about a night and a hammer and the sound of cob breaking and the knowledge that the wall he had tried to destroy was the reason he still had a body warm enough to feel shame with. On the evening of the second day, Walt spoke. His voice was thin, but the acoustics of the round room carried it to every ear. "You know why I helped her?" Callie shook her head. "Because I recognized it. What she does. My wife Helen built a stone wall around her garden. Dry stack, no mortar. Everyone said it would fall. It is still standing. 23 years. Every wooden fence in the county has rotted. Every wire fence has rusted through." He paused for breath. The rasp was louder. Helen understood stone the way this girl understands earth. The same understanding, the same patience, the same willingness to listen to the material instead of forcing it. Nobody moved. The fire popped softly. "I have been alone 23 years. Not because I chose solitude, because I could not find anyone who saw the world the way Helen and I saw it. Until her." He looked at Callie, and in his clouded eyes there was a clarity that the rest of his body could no longer match. "She understands." On the third evening, with the wind outside reaching a crescendo that seemed designed to test the limits of the word impossible, Sheriff Tom Brewer spoke. He looked at Callie. His eyes were red. "We were wrong," he said, clear, steady, addressing not one person but all of them. "We were fools, blinded by our own pride." He looked at his hands, the hands of the sheriff, the hands that had chosen the easy path when the hard path was the right one. "I knew who broke her wall." He turned to Cody. Cody flinched. "I knew, and I did nothing, because it was easier to do nothing. Because she did not matter enough to justify the cost of doing something." The fire crackled. The silence in the room was the silence of people hearing a truth they had known for months, but had lacked the courage to speak. Dorothy Hale made a sound, not the controlled weeping of a woman performing emotion for an audience, a small, strangled, genuine noise that came from a place she had not accessed in years. The sound of the mask cracking. Callie listened. Her expression did not change. She did not offer words of absolution because she had learned from Samuel that words are the cheapest building material and the least durable. Her forgiveness was structural. It was the warmth, the walls, the roof, the soup. She had forgiven them the moment she opened the door in the storm. Everything since was simply living inside that forgiveness, the way you live inside a house, not by talking about it, but by being sheltered by it. "Eat," she said quietly. "The storm is not finished." On the morning of the fourth day, the wind began to diminish. The solid roar faded to a moan, the moan to a whisper, the whisper to a silence so immense it felt louder than the storm. Walt was lying near the hearth. Callie sat beside him, her hand holding his. Dust lay pressed against the old man's body chin on his thigh. Walt opened his eyes. They were clearer than they had been since the night Callie pulled him from the snow. The pale blue-gray was sharp and bright, the way a sky clears in the moment, just before sunset, one last showing of light before the dark. He looked around the room. The curved walls, the stone hearth, the chimney that ran through 12 inches of earth and straw. 25 people alive, warm breathing, a community held together by clay and patience and the stubborn wisdom of a girl the world had thrown away. He looked at Callie, and he smiled, A small, thin smile, rare as rain in August on the Kansas prairie, the smile of a man who had spent 71 years looking for something and had found it in the last place in the last way he had expected. "Good house," he said. 2 words. The highest praise Walt Finch had ever given anyone or anything. 2 words that contained every afternoon of shared labor, every silent hour of kneading clay, every nod that meant "I see what you have done, and it is worthy." Callie squeezed his hand. "Thank you, Walt." He closed his eyes. Dust sighed. The fire whispered. Walt Finch did not open his eyes again. He went the way he had lived, without noise, without announcement, in warmth, inside a circle, surrounded by people, which was the one thing he had lacked for 23 years and the one thing he had been given at the very end. Callie's hand in his, the faithful dog pressed against his side, the smell of earth and wood smoke. Peace. Nobody spoke for a long time. Then Brewer stood and removed his hat. One by one, every person in the room removed their hat or bowed their head. In the round room, in the silence after the storm, 25 people honored a man most of them had never spoken to while he breathed. They gave him in death what they had denied him in life: acknowledgement, respect, the simple recognition that he had been here and that his being here had mattered. Callie held his still hand for a long time. Then she laid it on his chest and stood and walked to the door and lifted the bar and opened it. The world was white, not the white of fresh paint or clean linen, but the total, absolute, blinding white of a landscape erased and rewritten by a power that did not consult anyone about the edit. The sun blazed off an infinite plain of snow, brilliant enough to bring tears, and the brilliance was both beautiful and terrible because what it illuminated was absence. Redemption Creek was gone, not damaged, not partially standing, gone, buried. The town existed only as a series of soft white mounds, rounded and featureless, the sharp angles and straight lines that had defined it dissolved into curves by the weight of the snow. Streets, fences, property lines, the grid of certainty that humans had imposed on the prairie, all of it erased. The earth had accepted their structures and then in 4 days had taken them back. The silo stood untouched on the hilltop. Rust and earth round and solid against the white. Not a crack, not a breach, not a single section of cob displaced, not a single stone in the hearth shifted, not a single panel of the repaired roof loosened. The structure stood the way a stone stands in a river, the way a tree stands in a field, not by fighting the forces around it, but by being shaped to let them pass. The wind had spent 4 days throwing everything it had at that curved wall, and the wall had done nothing except continue to be round, and in doing nothing, it had won completely. Brewer walked around the exterior, slowly running his hand along the cob surface, the way Walt had done months before. He stopped at the section that had been vandalized and repaired the section that Callie had rebuilt thicker and stronger after Cody and his friends had smashed it with hammers in the moonlight. That section was no different from the rest. Solid, intact, seamless. The evidence of the attack had been absorbed into the wall and made part of its strength the way scar tissue in the human body is often denser and tougher than the original skin. He looked up at the silo and understood something that had been available to him for months, but that he had been too comfortable to see. The girl had not been playing. She had not been deluded. She had been right, and every person in Redemption Creek who had mocked her and dismissed her and looked through her as if she were made of air had been wrong, and the proof of it was standing 12 meters tall on a hilltop in the Kansas sun, rusted and earthen, and round and absolutely, immovably, irrefutably correct. 25 people climbed out of the silo and stood blinking in the terrible, beautiful light and looked down at the place where their lives had been and saw nothing they recognized. Then they turned and looked at the silo, and they understood. 2 weeks later, a mail carrier on horseback brought a letter addressed to Callie Reed, Redemption Creek. The return was from Carver, Kansas. Inside were 2 items. A note from a neighbor, Callie. "I am sorry to inform you that your mother Mary passed last month. She had been ill for some time but told no one. Before she died, she asked me to send the enclosed to you. She said you would understand." And a sealed envelope in Mary's handwriting. Callie opened it with shaking hands. The letters were thin, unsteady, the writing of someone whose grip on the pen was failing, but whose grip on what needed to be said was not. "Callie, there are things I never said. I say them now because time is almost gone and truth deserves to be spoken before I go. Your grandfather was not crazy, you know that. What you do not know is this: I was his student. Before I met your father, I was 19, studying with Samuel, learning to build with earth and clay. I loved every part of it. I believed in everything he taught. Then I met Frank. Frank hated everything Samuel was. I chose Frank. I chose safety and normal and the life that does not get you laughed at. I hid the part of me that believed in round walls and earthen floors so deep I nearly forgot it was there. But when I saw you with your hands in the clay, your eyes shining the way his used to shine, I remembered everything. And I knew you would build what I never dared. Redemption Creek. Samuel told me about it. He said the silo there was the best he had ever seen, perfect for what he wanted to build, and he planned to go there someday. He never made it. The notebook in the satchel, I put it there. His legacy through me to you. I am sorry I was not stronger. But in my silence, I was always on your side. Build Callie. For him, for me, for yourself, I love you. Mary. Callie read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it and placed it inside Samuel's notebook. Her mother's words beside her grandfather's drawings. 3 generations on the same pages. A circle that had been open for decades finally closed. She walked outside and stood on the hilltop in the cold, clean air, with dust beside her and the white prairie stretching to every horizon. The wind touched her face, gentle now, carrying the scent of snow and possibility. She did not cry. She stood for a long time and let the wind take something from her. Not tears. Weight. The accumulated weight of secrets and silence, and people who believed in something but were afraid to say so. Callie would carry that weight no further. She would build. Spring came, the snow retreated. The buried town emerged in pieces, damaged beyond simple repair, its structures sagging and broken in ways that went deeper than wood and nails. Nobody wanted to rebuild what had failed. The storm had delivered its curriculum in a language that required no translation. Squares shatter, circles hold, straight walls catch the wind, curved walls let it pass. The earth holds you up if you listen to it. It pulls you down if you fight it. Callie opened Samuel's notebook on a plank table outside the silo and showed the drawings to anyone who came. Brewer came first, no longer sheriff, no longer hiding behind a badge that had not made him brave. He found more peace in hauling stone and mixing clay than 14 years of law enforcement had ever provided. The first building was a community hall. Round, stone and cob. Designing from Samuel's plans, adapted by Callie's hands, built by the hands of every person in Redemption Creek. They mixed clay together, kneading it with their feet in a pit beside the creek, the same pit Callie had used alone for months. They hauled stone from the creek bed in wheelbarrows and wagons and on their backs. They pressed cob onto the walls with their bare palms, leaving handprints in the wet surface that dried and hardened into a permanent archive of who they had chosen to become. The process was transformative in ways that went beyond architecture. Men who had spent their lives working alone on separate farms found themselves standing shoulder to shoulder in a clay pit, their boots covered in the same mud, their arms aching from the same labor. Women who had spent years competing for Dorothy Hale's approval found themselves laughing together as they mixed straw and water and stamped it with their feet like children in a rain puddle. The children, freed from the tension of their parents' social anxieties, played on the mounds of fresh clay and got so thoroughly covered in red earth that their mothers gave up trying to keep them clean and let them be. There was something in the shared physical work that dissolved the barriers between people more effectively than any conversation or church service or community meeting could have done. When your hands are in the same clay as the person beside you, when your sweat falls into the same mixture, when the wall rises under both your efforts equally, and neither of your contributions can be separated from the other, the distance between you closes. Not because someone decided it should, but because the work itself does not recognize distance. Callie taught them as she worked, not in lectures or demonstrations, but in the way Samuel had taught her, by doing it alongside them and letting them watch and ask. She showed Harold Fenn how to test clay quality by rolling a small ball and dropping it. She showed Martha, the blacksmith's wife, how to find the right straw length by tearing it rather than cutting it, because torn straw has rough edges that bond better with the clay. She showed Tom Patterson how to apply cob to a vertical surface by starting at the bottom and working upward, pressing each handful firmly into the one below so that gravity became an ally rather than an enemy. She did not talk about her grandfather while she taught. She did not explain the history of the techniques. She simply showed them what to do, and if they asked where she had learned it, she said from someone who knew, and that was enough. The knowledge passed through her hands into theirs, the same way it had passed from the Pueblo builders to Samuel, from Samuel to Mary's secret memory, from Mary's hidden notebook to Callie's calloused fingers. Each transfer was a little different. Each receiver added something of their own. But the core remained, Earth wants to be shaped. You just have to listen to it. Dorothy Hale proposed the name. Samuel Reed Hall. It was approved without discussion. The woman who had led the mockery named the building after the dreamer whose granddaughter she had tried to erase. Everyone understood the weight of that gesture. Dorothy did not say, "I am sorry" again after that. She did not need to. The name on the building said it louder than any apology could. New homes rose across the landscape. Low walls, thick earthen plaster, rounded corners that presented no flat surface to the Kansas wind. Stone hearths with rocket stoves built to Samuel's specifications. The town that emerged from the snow was unrecognizable, softer, warmer, shaped by the land rather than imposed upon it. A settlement that looked from the right distance as if it had grown from the prairie rather than been hammered into it. Cody Walsh never said the words, but he hauled more stone than anyone, mixed more clay, stayed later. When the wall of Samuel Reed Hall was complete, he stood in front of it alone and ran his palm over the smooth surface, and something in his face that had been clenched since boyhood released. He was not forgiven by a speech. He was forgiven by the work, by the clay under his fingernails, by the wall that accepted his handprint alongside everyone else's. Nora Hale became what she had always been meant to be. She learned at Callie's side the way Callie had learned at Samuel's knee, through proximity and patience and the silent transmission that happens when hands share material. She learned to test clay by feel, to judge moisture content by weight, to read the drying pattern of a fresh cob section and know within an hour whether it would crack or hold. She learned the mathematics of thermal mass without ever calling it mathematics, understanding intuitively that a thick wall stores heat the way a deep pool stores water, slowly absorbing and slowly releasing, creating stability in a world of temperature extremes. Within a year, Nora was designing small structures on her own drawing plans, on brown paper, with a carpenter's pencil, submitting them to Callie for review, with the nervous eagerness of a student who wants desperately to earn her teacher's approval. Callie would study each drawing carefully, make a few corrections in the margins, and hand it back with a nod that Nora treasured more than any grade she had ever received in school. Their relationship was built on the same foundation as the walls they constructed together layer by layer, without rushing strong, because it was given time to cure. Dorothy did not interfere. She had lost the right to interfere, and somewhere beneath the rubble of the woman she used to be, she understood that her daughter was walking a path she herself had glimpsed once long ago before she chose the safer road. On Sunday mornings, Dorothy would sometimes stand on the porch of her rebuilt home, round-walled and earth-colored, and watch Nora walking up the hill to the silo with clay on her hands and purpose in her stride. And something would move across Dorothy's face that was not quite a smile and not quite grief, but something in between, the expression of a woman watching her daughter become the person she herself had been too afraid to be. They buried Walt on the hilltop beside the silo. Creek sandstone for the headstone, the same kind of rock he had fished beside for 70 years. Callie carved the inscription herself, letter by letter, with a chisel made from a railroad spike. Walt Finch, 1891 to 1962. He heard the wind sing. She planted a cottonwood sapling beside the grave. In time, it would grow tall enough to shade the stone. In more time, it would be the tallest tree on the hill. These things take as long as they take, and that is exactly as it should be. Years passed. Callie never left, never married, never held any title or position. The silo remained her home and became something more, a place where people came when they needed to sit in a round room and be reminded that the strongest shapes are not always the ones that stand the straightest. Dust grew old and fat and lazy, spending his days sleeping in the sun outside the silo door. The unofficial symbol of Redemption Creek reborn. A stray dog, like a rusted building, like a discarded girl. All three abandoned, all three reclaimed, all three become essential. Samuel's notebook sat on a shelf inside the silo, open to anyone who wanted to read it. Between the pages, Mary's final letter lay pressed flat, preserved, a flower made of ink and paper, and the courage it takes to tell the truth when you know you will not be alive to hear the response. One afternoon in autumn, years later, Callie sat outside the silo door in the spot where Walt used to sit. She was 30 years old. Her hands were the hands of a builder, calloused and strong, the skin permanently stained with the ghost of red Kansas clay. Her gray eyes, Samuel's eyes, were calm. Below her, the town of Redemption Creek spread across the gentle terrain like something that belonged there, a settlement of round roofs and curved walls, and earthen colors that merged with the prairie as naturally as the cottonwoods along the creek. Dust lay beside her, ancient and content. His breathing was slow, his tail moved once when a familiar figure appeared on the path from town, then settled back to stillness. Nora Hale, 24, now climbed the hill with clay on her hands and rolled drawings under her arm. The first architect of the new Redemption Creek. No degree, no license. Only a notebook full of an old soldier's dreams and the teaching of a girl who had turned those dreams into walls you could lean against. Callie watched her come and thought of the people who had brought her here. Samuel, who dreamed of this place and died before he could reach it. Mary, who kept the dream alive in a locked drawer for 20 years and released it in darkness on the last night. Walt, who recognized the dream in a stranger's hands and walked through a storm to save people he barely knew, and died in the warmth he had helped build. And herself, 18 years old, standing at the end of a dirt road with a leather satchel and nothing else in the world except a silence in her heart that was heavier than anything she carried on her shoulder. She opened Samuel's notebook to the last blank page, picked up a pencil. She did not write for herself. She wrote for whoever would come next, because that is how circles work. They do not end. They pass through hands. Every man builds walls. With career and reputation and money and conviction, he builds them straight and tall, so the world will see them and be impressed. But the question was never how high the wall stands. The question was always whether it stands when the storm arrives. And the storm always arrives. A square wall fights the wind. A round wall lets the wind go. A square wall accumulates force at its corners until the force exceeds the strength and the wall fails. A round wall distributes force along its entire surface, and at every point the force is manageable, and at no point is it fatal. Callie Reed did not set out to save a town. She set out to save herself by building a home that was true. And in doing so, without intending it, without asking for it, she created a place where everyone could be saved. Perhaps the lesson is not about walls at all. Perhaps it is about the shape of the life you build around yourself. Whether your certainties have corners where the wind can catch, or whether they curve and flow and let the storms pass through without breaking what holds you up. Walt Finch understood this. He lived 71 years looking for someone who saw the world the way he saw it, and he found her in a girl building a house from mud. He died in warmth inside the circle connected. Not the worst way to leave. The wind crosses the Kansas prairie tonight, the same way it has crossed it for 10,000 years, patient and eternal, and supremely uninterested in the structures human beings erect against it. But on the hill above Redemption Creek, inside a circle of steel and earth, a lantern burns. It has burned every night for years. It will burn for years to come. A small point of gold in the prairie, dark, steady, and warm, visible for miles in every direction. A lighthouse built by a girl the world threw away. Still standing, still warm, still home.